We've done all of the sensory pathways. Today's focus is going to be on the motor. So whenever you're thinking about sensory information, remember this has to come from the periphery and then go towards the central nervous system. So that means that we're going to be going from the lateral aspect of the body, generally, let's say, towards the medial aspect of the body where the brain and the spinal cord are. And then we're going to ascend up the spinal cord and up towards the brain. So that's why we call the sensory pathways the ascending pathways. Well, today we're going to go in the opposite direction. So this is motor. That means that we're going to descend. So we're going to go from the brain or the spinal cord and then out to the periphery. So moving from the CNS towards the PNS so that we can make the change at the effector. Now, even though I circled the cerebral cortex here, plans and initiates the voluntary motor activities, keep in mind this little note that I put for you over in the bottom left. Motor control is integrated at all levels through extensive feedback loops and interconnections. So that's why you will see information here from multiple parts of the brain. It's not just the cortex, even though that's generally what we talk about the most because of that that pre-central gyrus that houses that primary motor cortex. So yes, that does get referenced a lot, but as you can see here, other structures in the brain are also going to be important in order to help carry out this motor activity efficiently. So that's why you see all of these little arrows from different parts of the brain, because all of this is going to help with coordinating our motor output. If you look at this picture right here, what you're going to see on this left side, you'll see that this says ascending tracts. And then on the right side, it says descending tracts. So the ascending tracts are what we went over previously. So you guys had your spinal cord drawing, and if you filled in these different tracts, the dorsal column pathway, the spinal cerebellar, the spinal thalamic pathway we talked about, that is all last two classes. Now, this is the stuff that we're going to be focusing on more so today, is going to be the descending. So like I said, our motor tracts going from the CNS towards the PNS. And we'll walk through them step by step. Now, for this particular portion, remember this is somatic. So remember somatic relating to skeletal muscles. Last two times I talked to you guys, it was about the neurons that we call first order, second order, and third order. So whenever you see those words, that's always related to sensory. If you see upper motor neuron, or abbreviation UMN, or lower motor neuron, abbreviation LMN, then of course we're going to be talking about the motor pathways. Okay, so UMN and LMN, there's no first order, second order, third order at this point in time because we're looking at upper and lower motor neurons. So the upper motor neuron, the cell body will lie in a CNS processing center. The premotor and or primary motor cortexes in the brain that we've kind of already gone through. They will synapse on the LMN, and their activity either can facilitate or inhibit the lower motor neuron. So it can either tell the lower motor neuron to do something or to not do something. And then that lower motor neuron, the cell body will lie in a nucleus of the brainstem or the spinal cord, and it's only the axon, so highlight that, only the axon actually comes out of the central nervous system. So for our upper motor, the whole thing is going to be in the CNS, and then for the lower motor, it's just the axon that's going to come out of the CNS towards the periphery. Okay, it will innervate a single motor unit in the skeletal muscle, and we'll talk more specifically about what those motor units look like as we get into the skeletal system. Its activation triggers a contraction in the innervated muscle, and any damage to the LMN can eliminate the voluntary and reflex control over that innervated motor unit specifically. So for our motor information, conscious and subconscious motor commands will control the skeletal muscles by traveling over these three pathways. Now there's more than this, but these are the three that we're going to talk about. So again, I color coded for you guys, so that way it can kind of help you in your learning. Anything that's in this aqua-ish color is the corticospinal pathway. Anything in orange is the medial pathway, and anything in the pink is going to be the lateral pathway. So 3 new colors, because I didn't want you to get them confused with any of the other colors from our sensory information. Now you'll see here that we're talking conscious and subconscious, because we know skeletal muscle is under voluntary control, which means it's conscious. If you punch somebody in the face, you meant to punch somebody in the face. Okay, you did that. Cannot say that, oh, I didn't mean to. Yes, you did. You totally did. The subconscious is what you don't always control though. So when we're talking about the subconscious, then we would be looking at things like the basal nuclei and the cerebellum, which are going to help with the integration of that motor coordination. So kind of like what we saw in the first picture, all of those arrows were coming out where you saw the basal nuclei, hypothalamus, cerebellum. They're going to help make sure that all of it works kind of. The output of these centers, again, can stimulate or inhibit the activity of either the motor nuclei or the primary motor cortex. So remember that primary motor cortex is going to be in the precentral gyrus in the frontal lobe, okay? The postcentral gyrus and the parietal lobe is our sensory cortex. So now we're in precentral gyrus, frontal lobe. Okay, if you want on your spinal cord drawing, you can feel free to draw these in. So here's where they would be in regards to your descending pathways. Obviously, the name is going to tell you a lot. So the first part of the name I put down here can indicate either the nucleus or the cortical area of the brain where the tract originates. So corticospinal is obviously cortex to the spinal cord, whereas something like rubrospinal, that's going to be in the red nucleus, rubro meaning red. So these other things are going to be throughout the PowerPoint. You'll see kind of where it all starts. Whether that's going to be in a nucleus or a cortical area of the brain. But that is your picture if you are the visual learner that needs to draw things out to kind of help you remember them. All right, so let's talk about the corticospinal pathway. This is sometimes referred to as the pyramidal system. So if you see those words, pyramidal system, they're talking about this pathway, okay? It's just another term that can be used to describe this. Of course, we're talking voluntary control over skeletal muscles for the corticospinal because it's coming from the cortex to the spinal cord. So voluntary control and this rapid direct mechanism for controlling skeletal muscles, you can see rapid and direct. So it's going to happen quickly and it will go straight there. Begins at the pyramidal cells. That's why it's called the pyramidal system, the pyramidal cells of the primary motor cortex. And then again, I've already said this like 5 times. What gyrus is that? Precentral, perfect. So that's the precentral gyrus. The axons will go down the brainstem and the spinal cord, and they synapse on the lower motor neurons in the anterior horn, because remember, anterior has to do with your somatic motor, okay? Posterior is all the sensory, all of the sensory. Anterior, somatic motor. So then what was the lateral gray horn? Visceral motor, exactly. So we're going to be synapsing in the anterior horn, okay? We've got 3 pairs of descending tracts. So we've got in this entire corticospinal pathway, number 1, number 2, and number 3. We've got the corticobulbar, we've got the lateral, and we've got the anterior corticospinal tracts. So these 3 things all fall under the pyramidal system. For our corticobulbar tracts, this is going to, as you can see, look here, we're cortico-cortex, precentral gyrus, primary motor cortex. This is going to go to what we call the bulbar region, corticobulbar. So that is part of the medulla oblongata, okay? This is going to run from that premotor cortex, or excuse me, from the precentral gyrus, the primary motor cortex, into the medullary pyramids. So for our cortical bulbar, that means that it is not going to extend beyond the neck area, okay? We're just gonna go into the brainstem, and it's going to do conscious movements of these things that you see here: eyes, jaw, face, some muscles of the neck, and the pharynx. So it's not gonna go very low. It's gonna be mostly in the head region for the cortical bulbar tracts. Okay, the synapse on the lower motor neurons in the motor nuclei of cranial nerve. What number is this? 3 through what number? 7, and then we have 9, 11, 12. Okay, so I hope you learned your Roman numerals for your cranial nerves. So they synapse on the lower motor neurons in cranial nerves 3 through 7, 9, 11, and 12 in order to allow the conscious movements of these things in the area of the head and face. Axons synapse on the lower motor neurons, again, in anterior horns of spinal cord when we're talking about motor stuff. If we're talking about the lateral corticospinal tract, this is 85% of our axons are going to be decussating at the pyramids in the medulla oblongata. However, the other 15% in the anterior tract are actually going to cross over at this specific spinal segment in the anterior white commissure. What does commissure mean? You guys remember?
Oh, it's the bridge.
It's the bridge, perfect. So commissure means that we can take something from one side to another, right? So that's our bridge. So the white commissure, because it's myelinated axons, this is where they're actually going to cross over in that specific spinal cord segment. If we look at a picture of this, look at what's happening here. So we've got our motor cortex, right? We've got tract that's going to run down through the brainstem. We're going to go through the medullary pyramids. And then we have decussation that can occur here if we're talking about the lateral tract, or decussation that can occur in the commissure if we're talking about, what was the name of the other one? Anterior. Okay, so our two options for lateral and anterior, major difference between them is one will decussate at the pyramids, the other will decussate in the anterior white commissure. Okay, so
maybe I'm missing this. How do they know which one, like, which one they're going to go to?
How do they know?
Yeah, like, how do you know if it's going to, like, how do the signals know if they're going to go lateral or anterior?
That's what this video is for,
okay.
right here.
I'm like, I don't get.
That's okay. That's okay. So it will tell you, if you watch this little video right here, it will run you through the corticospinal pathway, and then you can basically see which ones, and it's a very visual type thing, which is why I put the video in there, because it is really great to actually see the whole projection from the brain all the way down through the tracts, and they'll separate out the lateral and the anterior for you, so that way you can kind of see how all of the differences actually occur and as to why. So definitely watch that YouTube video. We're not going to watch it today for time purposes, but that is a cool video. Okay, so again, here's your picture. Primary motor cortex, precentral gyrus. We're in the left cerebral hemisphere. For the cortical bulbar tract, remember, this is going to be going to the motor nuclei of different cranial nerves in order to take it to skeletal muscle, so not extending beyond the neck area. If we're talking about the anterior versus the lateral, remember, anterior crosses over in the pyramids, lateral, or excuse me, which one crosses in the pyramids? Lateral. See, even it sometimes gets me. Lateral crosses in the pyramids, anterior crosses in the white commissure. In order to get to the skeletal muscles on what side of the body? We started in the left, right, perfect, okay? So we start in the left, and we ultimately end up in the right to control motor skeletal muscles on the right side of the body. Okay, for the homunculus, we talked about the sensory homunculus on the prior discussions. So the motor homunculus is going to look kind of similar. We're still looking at a functional map of that primary motor cortex that'll correspond with specific parts of the body. So which muscles are stimulated depends on the region of motor cortex that is actually active. And remember, whenever we're looking at the functional mapping, the homunculus, just because somebody has a very large, let's say, abdomen, doesn't mean that there's going to be a lot of area devoted to that in the homunculus, because it's all about fine motor control. So that's what you want to highlight right there. The fine motor control is going to be actually in smaller structures. So you're going to have fine motor control in your fingertips, because your fingertips are going to allow you to pick things up and write and type. So you need that fine motor movement in areas like that. Whereas you don't really need necessarily fine motor control in something like your abdomen. So that's why the trunk is relatively small. The proportions are similar to what we saw in the sensory homunculus, but not exactly the same. And then, of course, an area of the primary motor cortex devoted to a specific body region is all about the density of the motor units involved. Again, if we need fine motor control, then the density is going to be greater. So that way we have more ability to control things. If we look at a comparison picture, you can see here, this is what we talked about previously. So this is the sensory, and remember I mentioned the lip. So we talked about how much sensory innervation is towards the lip or even towards the hands. Now, whenever you look at motor, you can see that they almost look, pretty much the same, but if you take a closer and deeper look, you can see that you actually have much skinnier arms on this motor homunculus than you do over here on the sensory. The sensory, the feet are actually bigger than they are on the motor. Of course, the hands are huge, right? Because we just talked about all of the things you need to do with your fingers. So more fine motor control, higher, greater receptor density in those areas. It's all about, can you do more things motor-wise, okay? All right, so that was our corticospinal pathway controlling the voluntary skeletal muscles in our body. We've got 3 different tracts that we have to remember from that: cortical, bulbar, anterior, and lateral. All right, now it gets kind of confusing because we have a lateral corticospinal tract, but then we also have what's called the lateral pathway. So don't let those two throw you for a loop, okay? In the lateral pathway, we're going to be talking about the rubrospinal tract. For our rubrospinal tract, lateral pathway, rubrospinal tract, medial pathway, you can see that we have 3 other things to discuss. So let's break apart the medial versus the lateral pathway. When we're looking at these, the centers in the brain, the cerebellum, diencephalon, brainstem, they can issue these somatic motor commands in response to subconscious processing. So corticospinal is all conscious, okay? So now we're getting into a little bit more of the subconscious information. The medial pathway, I highlighted for you, helps control neck, trunk, and proximal, that's the key word there, proximal limb muscles. Whereas the lateral is going to be about the distal limb muscles that will help perform those very precise movements. And these two together, you see here, they can modify or direct skeletal muscle contractions either by stimulating, facilitating, or inhibiting the lower motor neurons. For our medial pathway, you've got 3 things that you want to be aware of. For our medial pathway, when we're looking at the muscle tone and gross movements of the neck, trunk, and again, the proximal limbs, we have upper motor neurons, excuse me, located in the vestibular nuclei. Okay, you guys have seen that word before, but maybe it'll come to you in just a second if you don't remember where. So this is our vestibulospinal tract. Superior and inferior colliculi, you guys have seen those words as well. Tectospinal tract. And then the reticular formation. So we've talked about that as well. So now we're going to be looking at the medial and lateral reticulospinal tract. So let's walk through these. For our vestibular nuclei, remember vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve number 8. What we're going to be getting is information from that nerve regarding the position and movement of the head. And I've highlighted for you here in orange what the primary goal is for this particular pathway. We want to maintain posture and balance. So you know, if you get vertigo and it affects your inner ear, then it can cause you to have problems with balance. So the vestibular nuclei working with vestibulocochlear nerve help us with maintaining posture and balance through our vestibulospinal tracts. Interesting thing here, no decussation. Okay. So if we were to look at a picture of that, what you can see here is we've got the vestibular nuclei. These nuclei are near the junction of that pons and the medulla. And they're going to be using that vestibulocochlear nerve, which is attached to your inner ear, to respond to any changes that occur in your head. And they'll send the motor commands if there's any changes in your head to alter any muscles necessary in order to help you maintain your posture and your balance. So it doesn't matter if you turn your head upside down because you're going to go in a handstand. That information is going to be sent that you could still maintain posture. That's why people can stand on their hands, right, in a handstand. They don't just completely fall over. Now, it takes some training for that. That's just not an automatic thing because you have to then make sure that all of your other skeletal muscles are responding appropriately, and or you have enough strength to do something like that in your arm muscles. So there's a lot of components that go into that, but for those people who train their muscles in order to be able to do that, this is why they can stand on their head and then or on their hands and still maintain that posture. Okay, remember no decussation. So if we're looking at this picture right here, is this showing us the anterior brainstem or is this posterior brainstem?
It's like anterior.
What do you guys think?
Posterior.
Posterior? It's posterior. So the way you know is because you can see the corpora quadrigemina right here. Okay, so this is posterior because you have your superior and inferior colliculi on the posterior brainstem. So on this side, that would make this then the left. So left side vestibular nuclei, left side anterior horn. Okay, no decussation. All right, for our medial pathway carrying on, superior and inferior colliculi that I just showed you guys located in the tectum, which is the roof of the midbrain. So there was a picture of it here. Here's the tectum. The superior colliculi, remember we said they receive visual sensations and we learned about this in the brain. So if something is all of a sudden going to explode over here out the window and there's a lot of bright lights, you're going to be able to see that in your peripheral vision, and immediately it's going to cause reflexively your head to turn and see what's going on. Okay, so your superior colliculi will respond to those visual inputs, whereas the inferior will respond to the auditory inputs. So if something happens on the other side of the room, like out in the hallway, if somebody screams like you've never heard a scream before, again, you're going to move your head because you're responding reflexively to the loud scream, especially if it scares you. So those axons of the oculomotor neurons will descend in what we call the tectospinal tracts because we started in the tectum. They decussate immediately before descending to synapse on the lower motor neurons. And then the final destination is the cervical spinal cord only. So they do not go beyond the cervical spinal cord. They are going to direct, again, the reflexive changes in head, neck, and upper limbs in response to the things we just discussed, like the bright lights, sudden movements, loud noises, etc. So that's what that tectospinal tract is there for. Here's a picture of it. Again, superior and inferior colliculi in the tectum is where we're going to begin. And remember, there's an immediate decussation. So what you can see is there's an immediate crossing over as we are in the midbrain. Before we even go anywhere, we're going to decussate right then and there. Go on down through the rest of the brainstem and end in the cervical cord. Okay. And then lastly, for the medial pathway, we got to talk about the reticulospinal tract. So we're starting in the reticular formation. Remember, this is the structure that is within the entire brainstem. So in all parts, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, you have the reticular formation. Because of this is going to receive input from almost every ascending sensory and descending motor pathway. So there's a lot of information that the reticular formation is going to be receiving. The region stimulated determines the effects. So whatever region actually is under the stimulation will determine what's going to occur. So for example, the stimulation of the upper motor neuron in one portion of the reticular formation will produce eye movements, but stimulation of another will activate respiratory muscles. So it's really just about, of course, maintaining homeostasis like we've said all along. What needs to happen at that particular point in time for that person. The axons of the UMN descend into the medial, aka ponto-reticulospinal, and then the lateral, aka medullary reticulospinal tracts. Excuse me, without crossing over. So we've got the pontine reticulospinal, we've got the medullary reticulospinal. Okay, this is the one that we just talked about just a second ago. So these are the two that we just discussed on the last slide. So pontine, we're starting in the pons, medullary, starting in the medulla, again, descending, and we are not crossing over. So you can see it as compared to the tectospinal tract, which does cross over and descend. All right, and then I put up here for you, these projections are involved in preparatory and movement related activities, postural control, modulation of some sensory and autonomic functions, just because that reticular formation is so big and receives and sends so much information. Okay, for our pink lateral pathway, remember this is distal parts of the upper limb. So distal all the way to the very end, right? Towards the fingers, towards the toes. The axons of the upper motor neurons in the red nuclei, red, decussate in the midbrain, and then descend into the spinal cord and rubrospinal tract. So rubro, think about like a ruby. Ruby is red. Okay, so rubrospinal tracts come from the red nuclei. And again, only to the cervical spinal cord. I'll put a little asterisk here because they will maintain the motor control and the muscle tone in the upper limbs if the lateral corticospinal tract is damaged. So the corticospinal tract was the very first one that we talked about at the beginning, controlling those voluntary movements. If something happens to the lateral corticospinal tract, then this lateral pathway can take over to help maintain that control. Here's your picture. So starting in the red nucleus of the midbrain, crosses over to the opposite side, goes down through the pons, down through the medulla, keep going down, and then you can see here we've got cervical cord for our rubrospinal tract. Okay, limb control. Now, all of that is all conscious. Whenever we're talking more subconscious, basal nuclei, cerebellum help with that. for the coordination and feedback control over these muscle contractions. So remember the basal nuclei we talked about in the brain when we referenced Parkinson's, if they had the shuffling type gait, inability to stop the tremors within their hands, even if they are attempting to stop the tremors, that just doesn't work, because the basal nuclei will provide that subconscious control. So it provides the background patterns of movement that are involved in your skeletal control. You see here, do not exert direct control over the LMN. Instead, they adjust activities of the UMN in various pathways. And they can do this in two ways. So some axons will go to the premotor cortex, and then other axons will affect the reticulospinal tracts. So there is a little YouTube video right here that you can go back and watch to kind of refresh your brain on the basal nuclei, the different structures that are involved in it, and how that actually works in the brain as well. Okay, so you just want to think this is helping with the subconscious feedback and regulation of proper motor control. Okay, that's the big forest picture of it. And then the cerebellum, and remember when we did brain, we talked about how this is for fine-tuning those motor movements, and we talked about the athletes in this particular instance because they have such precision to the things that they do in their motor control in whatever sport they play. All athletes do. So the cerebellum will help monitor our proprioceptive, so that's our position in space. Where am I? Where's my arm? Where's my leg? Visual information from eyes, and then the vestibular sensations from the ear. Output of the cerebellum affects upper motor neuron activity in all pathways. Okay, so circle all pathways. The cerebellum will act like a brake and will help adjust the activities to make it smooth and precisely controlled. Of course, you can see here patterns of the activity are learned by trial and error over many repetitions. Steph Curry was not always that good at that three-point shot. Okay, he had to do that over and over and over again. It's that pattern over and over and over that helps with the fine-tuning of those particular movements. That's why it will improve with practice. That's why athletes can get better and better and better, because they can continue to improve with their motor muscle memory, motor muscle movements. So because the cerebellum is super important, and because this is something that is easier, I would say, to test in real life, I want you guys to watch this video. So we're going to look at this video for a few minutes, so that way you can actually see how the cerebellum can be tested whenever you are in a clinical situation. Okay.